You are standing in a windswept Norse assembly hall, the air thick with a mingled sense of pine smoke and unwashed bodies. Around you, bearded warriors grip their weapons while their eyes burn with a cold, calculating fury directed at the trembling figure in the center of the circle. The man before them committed no murder, stole no treasure, violated no sacred oaths, yet his fate will be worse than any common criminal's. A single word has just been spoken, a term so devastating that it strips away not just honor, but the very right to exist among the living. Arg, the accuser declares, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade through flesh. The accused man's face drains of color, for he knows that this moment will determine whether he lives as a man or perishes as something less than human. The assembled warriors nod grimly, understanding that they are witnessing not just an accusation, but a pronouncement of social execution, the systematic destruction of a human being through the most sophisticated system of masculine enforcement the ancient world ever devised. This devastating practice of gender policing represented one of the most brutal aspects of Viking society, a culture that transformed the mere perception of femininity in men into a legal justification for elimination. While we often celebrate Viking achievements in exploration, warfare, and craftsmanship, their treatment of men who violated gender norms reveals a society driven by an obsession with masculine performance that could literally determine life or death. The consequences of being labeled unmanly extended far beyond social embarrassment into a realm of systematic persecution that would make modern hate crimes seem restrained by comparison. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we are exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The term arg represented far more than a simple insult. It was a legal classification that could trigger the complete destruction of a man's existence. In Old Norse society, this word encompassed multiple levels of supposed masculine failure: cowardice in battle, adopting a sexually passive role with other men, or practicing seir magic, which was considered the exclusive domain of women. According to the Icelandic legal code, known as Grágis, calling someone arg constituted a formal legal accusation that demanded immediate response. The accused had three choices: challenge his accuser to homegang, ritual combat, provide legal proof of his innocence, or face automatic conviction and the harshest punishment Norse law could inflict. What made these accusations particularly insidious was their subjective nature and the impossibility of definitively disproving them. A man could be labeled arg for showing fear during battle, for possessing knowledge of healing herbs traditionally associated with women, or for displaying emotional responses deemed inappropriate for warriors. The accusation often arose from personal disputes, political rivalries, or simple social jealousy. But once spoken aloud in a legal assembly, it took on a life of its own that could consume not just the accused, but his entire family lineage. The legal framework surrounding arg accusations reveals the sophisticated nature of Viking gender enforcement. The Grey Goose Laws, Iceland's medieval legal code, explicitly stated that three words carried the penalty of full outlawry: rag, unmanly; stroin, used sexually by another man; and sorin, acting as a woman. These terms were considered so inflammatory that using them falsely could result in severe legal consequences for the accuser. But proving falsehood required the accused to successfully defend himself through combat, a requirement that many men found impossible to meet. The psychological impact of these accusations extended beyond the immediate legal consequences. Men living under the constant threat of being labeled arg developed elaborate behavioral codes designed to demonstrate their masculinity at every opportunity. They adopted aggressive postures, engaged in unnecessarily violent conflicts, and suppressed any emotions or interests that might be interpreted as feminine. This created a culture of hypermasculinity where men lived in constant fear of appearing weak, sensitive, or different from the narrow definition of acceptable manhood. Contemporary sources describe the devastating effects of arger accusations on entire communities. Families would distance themselves from accused men even before formal legal proceedings began, understanding that association with someone labeled unmanly could contaminate their own reputations. Children were forbidden from playing with the offspring of accused men. Wives faced pressure to abandon their husbands, and business partnerships dissolved overnight. The mere suspicion of unmanliness could trigger a cascade of social isolation that preceded and often determined the outcome of formal legal proceedings. The practice of homegang, while presented as a path to vindication, was itself designed to favor accusers over defendants. The ritual required elaborate preparation, specific weapons, and adherence to complex rules that disadvantaged anyone unfamiliar with combat protocols. Men who practiced peaceful professions, merchants, craftsmen, or scholars, often lacked the martial skills necessary to defend themselves effectively. The system essentially required every man to maintain combat readiness or face the possibility of social annihilation through legal dueling. Historical records from the period reveal that homegang challenges were often strategically timed to maximize the accused's disadvantage. Accusers would wait until their targets were ill, injured, or absent from their home territories before making formal challenges. The requirement that duels occur within 3 to 7 days of the accusation created additional pressure, as defendants had minimal time to prepare, gather supporters, or seek alternative resolution methods. The equipment requirements for homegang further disadvantaged those accused of unmanliness. Participants needed access to specific weapons, shields, and protective gear that were expensive and required maintenance. Men who had already been socially ostracized often found themselves unable to acquire proper equipment, as merchants and craftsmen refused to provide services to those under suspicion of arger. This created a vicious cycle where the accusation itself made successful defense increasingly difficult. Even successful homegang participants faced ongoing suspicion and monitoring. A man who barely survived a duel might be viewed as having proven his accusers partially correct, while overwhelming victory could be interpreted as evidence of excessive violence or emotional instability. The system created no clear path to complete vindication, ensuring that even successful defendants remained under scrutiny for future signs of unmanliness. The consequences of refusing homegang or losing the combat were immediate and devastating. The accused would be declared ninger, a term that meant dishonored one, and carried legal implications that stripped away all rights and protections. This designation transformed the individual from a person into a legal nonentity who could be eliminated without consequences. The change in status was announced publicly and recorded in legal documents, ensuring that the shame would be permanent and inescapable. Full outlawry, known as skaganger or going into the forest, represented the ultimate punishment for those deemed unmanly. This sentence removed the condemned from all human society and declared them legal targets for anyone who encountered them. The outlawed individual lost all property rights, family connections, and social protections, becoming what Norse law explicitly termed a wolf among men. This metaphor was not merely poetic, but reflected the legal reality that killing an outlaw was not considered murder, but rather a form of hunting. The process of becoming an outlaw involved elaborate legal rituals designed to maximize humiliation and ensure complete social separation. The condemned man's property was publicly confiscated and distributed among his accusers and the community. His name was struck from genealogical records. His children were forbidden from claiming him as their father, and his wife was encouraged to remarry as quickly as possible. These ceremonies served both practical and symbolic purposes, demonstrating that the unmanly man had forfeited his right to exist as a member of human society. Archaeological evidence from Viking Age sites reveals the harsh realities facing outlaws who survived the initial period of exile. Skeletal remains found in remote locations show signs of malnutrition, untreated injuries, and violent deaths that suggest prolonged suffering in isolation. Many outlaws died within their first winter in exile, unable to secure adequate shelter, food, or medical care without social support networks. Those who survived longer often developed physical and psychological conditions that marked them as obviously desperate and dangerous. The geographical challenges facing outlaws were particularly severe in Scandinavian landscapes. The harsh climate, dense forests, and mountainous terrain created natural barriers that made survival difficult even for experienced woodsmen. Outlaws were forbidden from seeking shelter in any human settlement, entering religious buildings, or receiving aid from travelers. This isolation forced them to survive entirely on their own resources in environments that challenged even well-equipped groups. Contemporary accounts describe outlaws as becoming increasingly desperate and dangerous over time. Deprived of normal social interactions and facing constant threats, many developed behaviors that reinforced their original persecution. Some turned to banditry, attacking travelers and stealing supplies, while others became hermits who avoided all human contact. These survival strategies often confirmed the original accusations against them, as their behavior became increasingly divergent from accepted social norms. The legal framework surrounding outlawry included provisions designed to prevent any possibility of redemption or return. Full outlaws were forbidden from participating in religious ceremonies, making legal agreements, or establishing any formal relationships with members of society. Even lesser outlaws, who faced exile for specific periods rather than life sentences, found themselves marked by their experience and unable to fully reintegrate into their communities upon return. The impact of outlawry extended to family members who remained in society. Children of outlawed men faced discrimination in marriage negotiations, business dealings, and social interactions. Wives of outlaws were often pressured to publicly renounce their husbands and demonstrate their own loyalty to community values. This created additional trauma for families already dealing with the loss of their primary breadwinner and protector. Some outlaws attempted to survive by seeking refuge in other communities or countries, but their reputation often preceded them. The interconnected nature of Viking-age societies meant that news of outlawry could spread rapidly through trade networks, making it difficult for exiles to establish new identities. Foreign communities were often reluctant to accept individuals who had been rejected by their own people, viewing them as potential sources of conflict or contamination. The psychological effects of outlawry were documented in contemporary sources that describe the mental deterioration of men forced into permanent exile. Separated from all familiar social structures and facing constant physical threats, many outlaws developed what modern psychology would recognize as severe depression, anxiety, and other mental health conditions. The absence of normal human interaction and the constant fear of violence created psychological trauma that often proved as devastating as the physical hardships of exile. The connection between accusations of unmanliness and the practice of seir magic reveals the deep contradictions within Viking masculinity. Seir, a form of shamanic practice involving trance states, divination, and magical manipulation, was considered the most powerful form of Norse magic, but was also viewed as inherently feminine. This created a paradox where the most effective magical practices were forbidden to men under penalty of social destruction. Yet men who possessed these abilities could wield enormous influence and power. The case of Odin himself illustrates this contradiction perfectly. As the chief god of the Norse pantheon, Odin was simultaneously the ultimate warrior and the supreme practitioner of seir magic. According to Snorri Sturluson's Ynglinga Saga, Odin's mastery of seir was so complete that he could predict the future, communicate with the dead, and manipulate the fates of men. Yet this same source acknowledges that such practices brought unmanliness, urgy, to those who engaged in them, creating a theological paradox that reflected the broader tensions within Viking society. The accusation of urgy against Odin by Loki in the Lokasenna demonstrates how even divine figures were not immune to gender-based attacks. Loki explicitly mocked Odin for practicing seir magic, calling him unmanly and suggesting that his magical abilities came at the cost of his masculine identity. Odin's response, redirecting the accusation back to Loki's own gender transformations, shows how these debates about masculine identity penetrated even the highest levels of Norse mythology. The practice of seir required practitioners to enter altered states of consciousness that were considered fundamentally feminine. The trance states, emotional openness, and receptivity to spiritual influences necessary for effective seir magic contradicted the masculine ideal of rational control and emotional restraint. Men who engaged in these practices risked not just social disapproval, but legal consequences that could result in outlawry or death. Contemporary accounts describe the elaborate measures taken by male seir practitioners to conceal their activities. Some practiced in secret, meeting only with trusted associates in remote locations. Others attempted to masculinize their practice by focusing on combat applications or combining seir with more traditionally masculine forms of magic. These efforts often proved futile, as the fundamental nature of seir remained incompatible with accepted masculine behavior. The female practitioners of seir, known as volar or psychona, occupied a complex position in Viking society. While their magical abilities were respected and their services sought after, they were also viewed with suspicion and fear. The power they wielded through seir magic made them valuable to communities that needed divination, healing, or protection, but also marked them as dangerous outsiders who operated beyond normal social boundaries. The connection between seir and sexuality was explicitly acknowledged in Norse sources. The practice was believed to involve forms of spiritual intercourse with supernatural beings, and practitioners were thought to experience ecstatic states that resembled sexual climax. This association made seir particularly threatening to masculine identity, as it suggested that men who engaged in the practice were adopting not just feminine roles, but specifically sexually receptive positions. The legal consequences for men caught practicing seir were severe and immediate. Unlike other forms of supposed unmanliness that might be disputed or defended, the practice of seir was often considered self-evident proof of orgy. Men discovered conducting seir rituals faced automatic accusations of org, with little possibility of successful defense. The intimate nature of the practice made it difficult to witness or prove, but when evidence emerged, the consequences were devastating. Archaeological evidence from Viking Age sites reveals the material culture associated with seir practice. Excavations have uncovered ritual staffs, iron rods, and other implements associated with magical practice in contexts that suggest their use was more widespread than literary sources indicate. These findings suggest that the practice of seir by men may have been more common than admitted, with practitioners taking elaborate precautions to avoid detection. The economic consequences of outlawry created additional incentives for accusers to target wealthy or successful men. The confiscation of property that accompanied outlawry meant that accusers and their supporters could benefit financially from successful prosecutions. This created perverse incentives where accusations of unmanliness might be motivated by greed rather than genuine concern for social order. The practice of declaring men arger was sometimes used as a political weapon by rival leaders or factions. Accusations of unmanliness could be strategically deployed to eliminate political opponents, disrupt alliances, or weaken competing power structures. The subjective nature of these accusations made them particularly effective as political tools, as they were difficult to disprove and carried devastating consequences for those unable to defend themselves. Historical records document cases where entire family lines were destroyed through systematic accusations of unmanliness. Once one family member was labeled arg, others became vulnerable to similar accusations through association. This created cascading effects where successful prosecutions could eliminate entire kinship groups from positions of power or influence within their communities. The international implications of outlawry created diplomatic complications for Viking Age societies. Outlaws who fled to other countries could become sources of conflict between communities if they engaged in criminal activities or attempted to rally support for revenge against their former homes. Some outlaws became mercenaries or pirates, using their desperate circumstances to justify increasingly violent and destructive behavior. The religious dimensions of outlawry added spiritual components to the punishment that extended beyond physical exile. Outlaws were forbidden from participating in religious ceremonies, making offerings to gods, or receiving the spiritual protections associated with community membership. This spiritual exile was considered as damaging as physical banishment, as it severed the individual's connection to the divine forces that governed fate, and fortune. Contemporary accounts describe the psychological preparation required for men facing accusations of unmanliness. The period between accusation and formal legal proceedings created intense anxiety and paranoia as defendants struggled to gather evidence, secure supporters, and prepare for potential combat. Many men reported sleep disturbances, loss of appetite, and other physical symptoms that reflected the extreme stress of facing social annihilation. The impact of gender-based persecution extended beyond individual victims to shape the broader culture of Viking society. The constant threat of being labeled unmanly created a culture of hypervigilance where men monitored their own behavior and that of others for signs of feminine deviation. This surveillance system was largely self-enforcing, as men policed themselves and their peers to avoid suspicion. The practice of erasing outlaws from family genealogies represented a form of historical manipulation that continues to affect our understanding of Viking society. By removing unmanly men from official records, Viking communities created sanitized versions of their history that obscured the true extent of gender-based persecution. This erasure makes it difficult for modern scholars to assess the full impact of these practices on Viking age populations. The contradiction between Viking values of individual achievement and conformity to gender norms created ongoing tensions within their society. While Viking culture celebrated exceptional individuals who achieved fame through extraordinary deeds, it simultaneously punished those whose achievements came through means considered inappropriate for their gender. This created a narrow pathway to success that excluded many talented individuals from full participation in their communities. The legacy of Viking gender policing extended far beyond the Viking Age itself, influencing medieval European concepts of masculinity and social order. The systematic nature of Norse gender enforcement provided a model for other societies seeking to control gender expression and maintain traditional power structures. These influences can be traced through medieval legal codes, religious teachings, and social customs that persisted for centuries after the Viking Age ended. The documentation of these practices in Viking literature and law codes provides valuable insights into the mechanics of systematic oppression in pre-modern societies. The detailed legal procedures, ritual requirements, and social consequences associated with gender-based persecution reveal how seemingly primitive societies could develop sophisticated systems of social control that rivaled modern totalitarian regimes in their effectiveness and brutality. Modern parallels to Viking gender policing can be found in contemporary societies that use legal, social, or economic pressure to enforce conformity to traditional gender roles. The mechanisms of accusation, public shaming, and systematic exclusion employed by Viking communities continue to appear in various forms wherever societies seek to control gender expression or punish deviation from accepted norms. The psychological research on gender-based persecution provides insights into the long-term effects of the Viking system on both victims and perpetrators. The constant stress of living under threat of gender-based persecution likely created widespread psychological trauma that affected entire generations of Viking age populations. The perpetrators of this system also suffered psychological consequences, as the requirement to constantly monitor and punish others created cultures of suspicion and paranoia that undermined social cohesion. The economic costs of gender-based persecution extended beyond the immediate loss of outlawed individuals to include the broader social costs of maintaining the enforcement system. The time and resources devoted to monitoring gender conformity, conducting legal proceedings, and enforcing punishments represented significant investments that could have been directed toward more productive activities. These costs may have contributed to the eventual decline of the Viking Age social system. The international reputation of Viking societies was significantly influenced by their treatment of gender nonconformity. Contemporary foreign observers often commented on the harsh nature of Norse gender enforcement, viewing it as evidence of barbarism or cultural backwardness. These perceptions affected diplomatic relations and trade partnerships, as other societies were reluctant to engage with communities known for their brutal treatment of vulnerable individuals. The role of women in perpetuating gender-based persecution reveals the complex ways in which oppressive systems recruit victims to participate in their own oppression. Viking women often served as informants, accusers, and enforcers of masculine gender norms, despite their own vulnerable position within the same patriarchal system. This participation reflected both the internalization of oppressive values and the practical necessity of demonstrating loyalty to survive within hostile social environments. The seasonal patterns of gender-based accusations suggest that practical considerations influenced the timing of these prosecutions. Many accusations occurred during winter months when communities were confined together for extended periods, creating opportunities for conflict and suspicion. The harsh conditions of Viking winters may have intensified social tensions and made communities more likely to seek scapegoats for their hardships. The connection between gender-based persecution and military effectiveness raises questions about the practical consequences of excluding potentially talented individuals from full participation in Viking society. The systematic elimination of men who might possess valuable skills in healing, diplomacy, or strategic thinking may have weakened Viking military capabilities and contributed to their eventual decline as a dominant force in medieval Europe. The preservation of these practices in Viking literature and legal codes reflects the importance that these societies placed on gender conformity as a fundamental organizing principle. The detailed documentation of procedures, penalties, and justifications for gender-based persecution indicates that these were not aberrant practices, but central features of Viking social organization that required careful regulation and legal codification. The evolution of gender-based persecution throughout the Viking Age reveals how these practices adapted to changing social conditions while maintaining their essential character. As Viking societies became more centralized and Christianized, the specific mechanisms of gender enforcement changed, but the underlying commitment to punishing gender nonconformity remained constant. This adaptability suggests that the persecution of feminine men served important functions for Viking society that transcended specific religious or political systems. The wind still howls through that ancient assembly hall, carrying with it the echoes of accusations that could destroy lives with a single word. The trembling figure in the center of the circle represents not just one man's fate, but the systematic machinery of gender enforcement that defined Viking civilization. The bearded warriors who surrounded him were not motivated by personal hatred, but by adherence to a social system that demanded the elimination of anyone who failed to conform to narrow definitions of acceptable masculinity. Their cold, calculating fury was not spontaneous emotion, but the institutionalized violence of a society that had chosen to define itself through the exclusion and destruction of those deemed unworthy of male identity. The sophistication of Viking gender policing reveals a civilization that was simultaneously capable of remarkable achievements and systematic brutality. The same culture that produced extraordinary art, literature, and exploration also developed legal mechanisms for the complete annihilation of individuals whose only crime was failing to conform to gender expectations. This contradiction forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that civilizational advancement and social progress do not necessarily coincide, and that societies can develop remarkable technical and organizational capabilities while maintaining systems of oppression that would horrify modern observers. The legacy of Viking gender enforcement extends far beyond the medieval period, providing insights into the mechanisms through which societies control and punish gender nonconformity. The accusation of arg, the ritual of homegang, the sentence of outlawry, and the erasure from family histories represent a comprehensive system of social control that continues to influence contemporary debates about gender, identity, and social acceptance. Understanding these historical practices helps illuminate the roots of modern prejudice and the enduring human capacity for both creativity and cruelty in the service of social conformity. The Bronze Age in that windswept hall might have ended over 1,000 years ago, but the questions it raises about masculinity, identity, and social belonging remain as urgent today as they were when Norse warriors first gathered to judge their peers. The Arger designation may have disappeared from legal codes, but the impulse to define social membership through gender conformity continues to shape human societies in ways that echo the harsh justice of Viking assemblies. The trembling figure in the center of that ancient circle represents not just a historical curiosity, but a persistent reminder of humanity's capacity to create systems of belonging that depend on the systematic exclusion of those deemed different.